2 weeks ago, we began our series in John, and what a beginning that was. If you all were here, you remember that was a struggle for me. But we looked at John chapter 1, verses 1 to 14, and we discussed how John his overarching theme throughout the whole book is the glory of the King, and calling us to believe and calling us to know Jesus. He doesn't go about the normal course of the other Gospels. He goes about it in a 90% different format of including different material than the others do, but he goes about it in a format to call us to believe. We don't have the birth narrative included. We don't have some of the other familiar passages included. John doesn't even introduce himself besides referring to himself as the beloved disciple. So here we have an account of the life of Jesus from the best friend of Jesus, about the life of Jesus calling us to believe in the King. And so this morning we pick up in John chapter 2 and verse 1. And it says, "On the third day there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, 'They have no wine.' And Jesus said to her, 'Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come.' And his mother said to the servants, 'Do whatever he tells you.'" Verse 6, "Now there were 6 stone water jars there for Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. And Jesus said to the servants, 'Fill the jars with water.' And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, 'Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast.' So they took it. And when the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who drew the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, 'Everyone serves the good wine first. When the people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now.' This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him." Now, think about this for a moment with me. If you were to pick the way that the incarnate Messiah were to enter the scene of the glory of earth, how would you choose it? How would you choose it? Think about all the ways that Jesus could make a statement. We could go back to the way in Matthew chapter 4 where the tempter enters the scene. Satan comes into the picture. Remember, the tempter, Satan, tries to get Jesus to make a statement, tries to get Jesus to turn stones into bread, tries to get Jesus to jump off the top of the temple in the midst of the crowds, declaring and showing his glory to all, declaring himself the king of the kingdoms of the world. Those would seemingly make quite the impact. The world would know that somebody of quite the resume had entered the scene. Perhaps in our day and age, we are drawn to people who can make a great speech. If any of you ever remember the movie Independence Day, probably filmed somewhere around here, right? Do you remember the movie? Probably one of the greatest moments in the movie Independence Day is where the president is in the hangar and he's going to get in that fighter jet and they're going to go fight whatever is attacking the world. And he gives that great moment, that great speech. Now, if you don't watch movies, and I'm sorry, you're just missing it here. But remember in the moment in the movie where he just stands and he says, "This is our Independence Day." That great moment in the movie where we're all drawn in to what happens. Or the movie, for some reason, I keep going back to, which it's not on my favorite list here, but Braveheart. Where he's standing in front of his comrades and he's saying, "They're greater than us, they're outnumber us, but they're fighting for their freedom." So we look at all these other scenarios and you can think, Perhaps Jesus could have come on the scene with a scepter and just declared himself the king of the world. So many other ways Jesus could have entered the scene, could have come about here. But here in John chapter 2, we find Jesus' first great sign, first miracle. By our standards might seem quite inconsequential or even odd for God. For the man who can move mountains to be troubled with the mere factor of making a bit of wine. Think about it. He goes to a wedding, they run out of wine, and this is going to be how he makes his first statement. This is his coming out. I mean, think about it for a moment here. Jesus, God, he could have come on the scene and fireworks exploding and the fireworks be stars. Because he put the stars in their place. He could have rearranged the stars in a great moment here. I mean, remember, the star drew people into him in his birth. So now he's coming into his ministry after 30 years. He could have rearranged the stars into this great celestial thing. But here he comes into the scene and it's about making wine at a wedding because they ran out of wine. But that's not the message here. The message here is demonstrating the glory and the power of God even in the small things. Here in John 2, Jesus has just been invited to a wedding along with those first disciples, the first 5 disciples that we can read about in the end of John 1. And we cannot take this subject of a wedding lightly. It's not something that we want to read over and miss the point of here. There's no coincidence here that the wedding feast is the first great sign that Jesus is performing here. Many of you who aren't married hope to be married, or many of you, when you were still single, you would go to weddings and you would sit back as a single person at a wedding. Think back to this. Now, some of you are going to think further back than this, but remember when you go to a wedding, you're sitting there at the wedding as a single person, and you're sitting there thinking, man, one day I want to be married. Or you're sitting back there thinking, now women, I understand that you start planning your wedding from the day that you can put thoughts together. Us men, we show up to the wedding and we're like, now how's this going to go down? You know what I'm saying? But for the girl, from what I understand, now I don't really understand how this works, but for the moment you can start playing with dolls and you can start thinking of a princess as you started putting your wedding plans together. You know what I'm saying? And when the guy shows up, we're like, okay, we're just going to get married. We're going to go. We're going to say, I do, and we're done. Right? And that's how guys put it together. And the girl's like, nuh-uh. We've got the perfect plan here. And so this is not an inconsequential scene that's going on here. Think about this for a moment. When you first went to a wedding as a single guy, maybe in college or something like that, you start dreaming about what it might be, what your wedding day might be. You start looking forward to the day when you might have a bride of your own. And get this. When we look throughout all of biblical history, the wedding ceremony represents so much the purity of the bride, the joining together of 2 families into one, the completeness of marriage, the hope of the future, the joy of love. A wedding is supposed to represent a lot of positive things, the joy in union. We go back all the way to Genesis 1 and 2 and we start seeing this come together. Marriage is ordained by God in the very beginning when he looks down and realizes that all of creation is grand. Man is good, but man by himself, well, that's just trouble. Right? That's not going to work out so good. So he knocks man out and he creates woman out of the bone of man just to bring some stability to the planet, right? This is where the women go, yes. And Adam wakes up, and after naming all of the animals, which was an interesting thing in itself, he's like, yes. And so in Genesis 2, we have a jaw-dropping open, and he says, this is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. He says, I'm going to call this woman. So we begin to see this union form together. And even as we get down in this passage here, Jesus is making a pretty direct statement. If you are looking at this, he begins to point out the importance and the significance of a marriage here. Marriage is the union ordained by God from the beginning of creation, signifying the joining together, the covenant bond of 2 people for their lives, where 2 become one. And as the gospel picture continues to unfold throughout Scripture, marriage is much more. For the ultimate groom is Christ. We are the bride, you and I, and it's a coincidence that Jesus is at a wedding feast? No. Is it a coincidence that Jesus is at a point of celebration and joy to begin his ministry? Think about this. Is it a coincidence that Jesus' first entry into ministry is a point of celebration and joy? No. For what is the whole goal of Jesus coming to earth? To be the ultimate bridegroom. What is the whole goal? What is the purpose of the life of Christ? It's the marriage supper of the Lamb, a place where there is joy unlike this world has ever seen. We should not miss the symbolism that's happening here. Because think about this. After there were Adam and Eve in the garden, they chose to be their own gods. They chose to make their own decisions. They chose to sin. They chose to, it would be better to taste the fruit when God said not to. So they chose that rationalizing to be their own beings, to be their own gods, was better than to be obedient to God and to submit to God. So what happens? Death enters into the world. They were living in bliss over here. They had everything they could possibly want. God created woman to be with man so they could have the fullness of joy with God for all of eternity. He says, but you don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Satan comes in and says, but did God really say this? Did God really put it this way? They begin to second guess. Satan goes, if you eat the fruit, you would be like God. Adam and Eve decide it's better to be like God. So God gives them the greatest gift ever after sin enters the world. He gives them death. And he gives them hardship and toil. Why? So they don't have to go on living in sin forever. Fast forward a few thousand years, what is the point of Jesus coming into the world? To bring restoration to brokenness that happened in Genesis. What do we look forward to in Revelations is the reunion that's going to happen at the marriage supper of the Lamb, where there's fullness of joy, where there's fullness of life again. There is affirmation and hope. There's affirmation in marriage, and the ordination of marriage is true. It's not something that we make up in our mind. It's not something that's defined by a culture. It's not something that we define as a people. When we debate marriage, it's not something that we debate. It's not something we get to define. It's something that God has defined for us in Genesis 29, in Judges 14, in Ruth chapter 4, which we studied just recently, in Matthew chapter 24 and 25, and Luke chapter 12. God puts this together. Why? To demonstrate the kingdom of heaven. To point us to be and to desire to be with him. There is what God is pointing out for us to want to be with him. So when Mary comes to Jesus and says, they have no more wine, and Jesus says to her, woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. This is packed here. This is packed with emphasis. Now, let's have a little bit of fun with it. Jesus and the disciples come to the wedding. Jesus has reached the age of 30 plus. Now, the assumption that we make here is that Jesus is his dad. Joseph has passed on at this point, because we can infer that as we get closer to the crucifixion point. So Jesus has been taking care of Mary at some point. So when Mary comes to Jesus and says, there is no more wine at this wedding, she is used to Jesus solving the problems here. But she also comes to Jesus and says, take care of the problem. Take care of what we're missing here. And his response is, woman, what does this have to do with me? Now, men, I'm 34 years old, and if I ever said that to my mom, it ain't gonna go well. Let's just put it that way. I was raised in the Deep South, and the level of respect you have for your parents in the Deep South maybe doesn't translate all the way over here to the West. But when you use the words woman to your mom, it may be followed by a big stick. You know what I'm saying? You still say yes, ma'am at 34, and no, ma'am at 34. You know what I'm saying? Jesus says, woman, what does this have to do with me? Now, there's some debate over what he means by this. He's like, I'm 30. Why are you giving me chores to do at this point? I'm my own man. Now, that's not the direction that this translation goes. So don't go there. That's not how this is translated. There is some respect here. And there is something we need to learn from this. There's something we all need to learn from this. When Jesus refers to his mom as woman, it is showing respect. It is showing respect to the culture. What he's showing here, and what we need to learn here, especially from those who might come from a Catholic background, is there's no backdoor way into the kingdom here. There's no backdoor way. There comes a point where, yes, Mary gave birth to Jesus. Mary was the mother of Jesus. But at this point, Jesus has entered into his time of ministry. And there's no end and around into the kingdom here. Mary's not accepted into the kingdom based on her motherhood to Jesus. Do we follow that? Do we get this point? Mary's not accepted into the kingdom based on the fact that she is the mom of Jesus. Let that sink in. We don't pray to Mary to get things from Jesus. Why? Because there's a separation that we see distinctly delineated here when Jesus says, what does this have to do with me? There comes a point in the life of Jesus where he draws the line in the sand and he says, there's a difference between mom and God. Remember, I created you. I put you here before you gave birth to me. Let that sink in for a minute. I created you. Remember John 1? In him all things were created. Without him nothing was created that has been created. I created you. I put you in your place exactly as I wanted things to be. I created you. Jesus begins to set up the need for the gospel for all people. Jesus' response here may seem harsh, but the lack of wine here is not the biggest deal here. He says, my hour has not yet come. And the thoughts come to the forefront. The wine is run out. Therefore, the joy is going to fade. For the lack of wine means a massive disgrace to the groom's family who is hosting the celebration. It could go so far to even mean a lawsuit to the bride's family. So Mary is thinking on a practical, felt need thing here. Jesus is beginning to teach the gospel to Mary and to his disciples here. Mary is thinking on a practical, felt need. We've got to deal with a problem here. And Jesus is beginning to teach. My hour is not yet come. The lack of wine is a major deal in this wedding celebration because get this, we celebrate weddings in 30 minutes. Like we come in, I do, we're done. Celebrate, party, move on. We're going to the honeymoon that night. They come in this culture and weddings last 7 days. The bride's saying like, I ain't gonna pay for that. And so you see Mary's conundrum here. 7 days of partying, the wine starts running out. It's going to bring shame to the bride's family because they're paying for this. And even in the culture, it can mean a lawsuit on the bride's family. So this starts to become a huge problem here. And so Jesus' response is, my hour has not yet come. Jesus is aware of a much greater reality here. And the momentary lack of wine is not the only problem here. For the temporary joy of the party is just that. It's only temporary, for it will not be sustained forever in the midst of the pain of the world. It's only temporary, for nothing can sustain, nothing can restore until the full cup, get this, until the full cup of wrath is poured out. Get this, they drank wine out of cups here in this moment, not out of the fancy glasses that we have. And so Jesus is using this imagery to say that nothing is going to take away the pain that they're trying to forget for the moment until the full cup of wrath has been poured out. This is a momentary affliction that they're trying to deal with, not an eternal thing. There are a couple of things that Jesus does and points out here as he responds to his mother. The time has come for separation from the motherly ties here. There's a distinctness here in this conversation. Jesus is no longer the son. We pointed that out. Jesus was never just the son of Mary, but now he enters into this time of public ministry, this time of ministry for which he has come to declare the kingdom of heaven has come. The kingdom of heaven has come. The time has come for Mary to no longer recognize Jesus as son, but Jesus as Lord, Jesus as Messiah, as the one whom Gabriel told her about when he visited her before she was pregnant. The time has come for the relationship to be much more about teaching Jesus how to read, about teaching Jesus how to take care of himself, about how to bathe himself, about how to clothe himself. It's about much more than it's about how to understand the relationship was no longer Jesus, I raised you, I brought you into this world, but rather Jesus. About Jesus telling Mary, I created you. For what has this to do with me? For my hour has not yet arrived. The hour has not yet arrived. Think about this language. Have you ever been around someone who doesn't use a lot of words, but when they do use words, you need to think about and process every time they use words. Now stop thinking about me in this thing, okay? Don't analyze what I'm saying here about me. Now think about when Jesus starts using words, you need to think about what Jesus says here, because remember, when he speaks, it becomes scripture. And so when Jesus says, my hour has not yet come, we look at this phrase in context of the rest of the teachings of Jesus, and we know that when he's speaking about his hour, he's talking about his death. He's talking about his death. He's not talking about the calendar. He's talking about the impending death, the moment in which he will take the wrath of God that's going to be poured out on himself and be restored into communion, the fulfillment of the promises of Genesis chapter 3. After Adam and Eve decided it was right to be their own God, he's talking about the impending death and wrath, that hour that Jesus is pointing us towards. We see in John chapter 12. If you want to flip there, John 12:27, he says, my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. For this purpose I have come for this hour. Father, glorify your name. And then a voice came from heaven. He says, I have glorified it. John 13. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. John 17, one of my favorite chapters in all of Scripture, John 17, he says, when Jesus had spoken these words, he lifted up his eyes to heaven and he said, Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that the Son may glorify you. The hour, the need of the party was not just more wine, but of greater sustenance. For the joy of the party can never be sustained in the life of the marriage in this world. It wasn't about the marriage in this world, for the joy of the party can never be sustained here. It wasn't about sustaining the life of the party, no matter how long it might last. When Mary looks back to Jesus and begins to panic, worried about the shame that is going to be cast on the party, on the groom and on the bride, Jesus sees the far greater reality of this momentary affliction, and he sees the coping. And he points to the eternal condition, seeking ways to help us to find peace or joy in the moment, in the midst of pain, the suffering, the shame, and the angst. Jesus knows, looking at the party, the only real solution to shame, the only real solution to pain is the cup that will be poured out on the cross when his blood is poured out for the sins of the world. And that time has not yet come. Get this, when he says, my hour has not yet come, he's pointing us to a far greater emphasis and a far greater need for the kingdom. But get this, Mary is a mom. Mary is a mom. And so Jesus over here talking about my hour has not yet come, and mom is like, okay, you deal with your hour. And Mary is still faithful in the moment here. And Mary does not hesitate. She turns to those who are serving at the party, and notice what happens. She says to them, do whatever he asks. She doesn't miss a beat here, at least as John records it. Bold faith, perhaps resilience. Notice the text. Now there were 6 stone jars there for Jewish rites of purification. Now this is verse 6. Each holding 20 or 30 gallons. And Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. And they filled them up to the brim. Jesus doesn't have the servants get the empty wine containers or the empty wine skins or the glasses or the jars. He has them get the pots that hold 20 to 30 gallons each for the purpose of cleansing. For the purpose of cleansing, he has those who are serving to go and fill the jars with water. Now, this is going to end up being close to 100 to 150 gallons total. Let that process in your mind for just a moment. 100 to 150 gallons of water. That's a lot of water, especially if you live around here. It's a lot of water. That was a joke about the drought, but moving on. I'm going to keep telling my jokes out. Again, we cannot take any of the passage lightly here. Jesus is not condemning the party. He's about celebrating the marriage of this couple. Okay, all of us fundamental Baptists here need to start taking note of what's happening here. Jesus is not condemning the party. He's about celebrating here. He doesn't go to Mary and start giving her a life lesson of, well, if we really understood what was going on here, we would shut this down and begin giving a life lesson on what we really need to be talking about here. No, he says to the servants, go take these 6 jars and fill them up to the top. Now we're about to have a lot of fun with this, so stick with me here, especially all of us fundies here. We're about to have some fun here. And he begins and he starts showing love to these people who have gotten married, to the groom, to his family, and to the bride, and to her family. And he shows the message of the kingdom. He shows the message of the kingdom to those who are close to them and to this whole gathering here. Pots for purification at the party, at the wedding feast with the Messiah, who symbolizes purification to the world. Don't miss that he uses the purification pots. Why? His life is going to be poured out as purification. The pots are there so that people attending the wedding can be purified as they enter into the feast or enter into the celebration. He's going to use these pots for a whole different party. Catch this. The irony here is wonderful. Jesus is providing wine and purification pots. Everyone from this party is going to drink the wine out of one of these vessels that is meant for ritual cleansing. That is meant for cleansing, and they're going to partake in drinking together. Jesus is pointing us forward to when the cup is poured out, to when the people will be cleansed by the blood of the new covenant, and the old ritual customs would no longer be necessary. But here in the moment, he is providing the most wonderful, the most excellent wine for them to drink from these pots. And we pick up in verse 8 of John chapter 2, and he said to them, now draw some water and take it to the master of the feast. Now this would be like the maitre d', or this would be like the man in charge of all the party here. And so they took it, and when the master of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, and did not know where it came from, he called the bridegroom and said to him, everyone serves the good wine first, but you have kept the good wine until now. This is the first sign of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee. Now, follow this. Jesus is taken to the master of the feast, who we would view as the one in charge of the whole party. His whole job is to make sure the party keeps going, it stays lively, and people stay happy. And he has them take the wine there to be tested and approved. And when it's tested, the master is stunned. He's stunned, for this is the best wine of the whole celebration. Think about it. If these people have been partying and going on for 3 days and have been drinking wine, you're going to think they're winos. But that's a different point. This wine that they've been drinking has probably been watered down, probably a third wine and water, and the rest. Here it is. They show up at the party, and this wine is here. It's been brought from these 6 pots. And it doesn't even come from grapes. This never even touched the ground. It's never even seen the sun. This wine shows up that God has supernaturally provided. I would guess this would be some pretty supernatural wine. This isn't going to be that cardboard box stuff. This is going to be that amazing stuff. The master's surprised, and we're 3 days in here, and he's saying, where has this been? Where has this been? Jesus has provided 100 to 150 gallons of the world's best wine from nothing. Get this picture. Let this sink in. No grapes. No fermentation, no sun to grow the grapes, no sun to dry it out, no process of making the juice. The men went and drew the water and took it to the master, and it was wine. This is making something out of nothing. At this moment, we see the response of those who were witnesses, and the disciples believed in him. He manifested his glory, and they believed, and he did not cause the stars to create a magnificent show and take over the wedding feast. He didn't make the show all about him. He did not cause or draw a great amount of attention to himself. He did not even deliver the wine, but his glory was manifest. The gospel was displayed to those whom God wanted to see the moment. And the joy was spread to all. Grace for all. Grace for all. There's much in these 11 short verses this morning. We can look at this and say, whoa, Jesus, wine. Perhaps this is a hard story for us Southern Baptists to sink in, but Jesus didn't show up and shut down the party. Jesus showed up and provided so that the party could continue. Jesus didn't endorse drunkenness here. Let's think about this. Jesus doesn't endorse drunkenness. In fact, throughout the Bible, it speaks about drunkenness in Ephesians 5:18, Galatians 5:21, 1 Corinthians 6, 1 Peter 5, on and on and on. But rather, what Jesus does here in this moment is he points to joy. He points to the ultimate wedding feast while at the same time foreshadowing the very cup that would have to be poured out for the consummation of the wedding of the Lamb. He points us forward to what would be necessary for the consummation of the wedding of the Lamb. Edmund Cloudney, a great preacher, once said something like this as he was preaching. Catch this. He says, Jesus sat amongst all the joy, sipping the coming sorrow. So today we can sit amongst all the world's sorrow, sipping the coming joy. Jesus sat amongst all the joy, sipping the coming sorrow. So today we can sit among all of the world's sorrows, sipping the coming joy. In the midst of all of the joy, why was he saying, woman, hour, death? In the midst of all that joy, he was in a sense sipping or foretasting the sorrow to come so that we can sit in the middle of all of our sorrow and all of our pain and all of our anxiety and all of our troubles and all that we know, sipping of what we know to be a joy that is coming, a joy that is immediate, a joy that Jesus is bringing to us. We can sit and look face in the death and say, death is but joy. Death is but a celebration. The wine is not about drunkenness or even about drinking. The wine is about redemption. It is about joy. It is about love. Throughout Scripture, we can read that wine represents joy and points us to a new covenant in Christ. Psalms 104:14, it says, you cause the grass to grow for the livestock and plants for man to cultivate, that he may bring forth food from the earth, and wine to gladden the heart of man, oil to make his face shine, and bread to strengthen the man's heart. Isaiah 55:1, come everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and he who has no money, come and buy wine and milk without money, without price. Matthew 26. Catch this. Now as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it, broke it and gave it to the disciples, says, take, eat, this is my body. And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many of the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink of it again, of this fruit of the vine, until when I drink it with you in my Father's kingdom. Now, before you leave here this morning and says, Chad said, go buy wine and have a party, that ain't what I'm saying. It's not what I'm saying. That would be fun, but that's not what I'm saying. It's not exactly what I said. What we're saying here is when we come to Christ, is we are called to a higher joy. We are called to a higher joy. Go back to our first question. Why does Jesus show up at a wedding? perhaps as his first sign of ministry. Weddings were the ultimate feast of the day in the life and time of Jesus. Ultimate time of celebration. The ultimate feast of the greatest food, the greatest drink, the greatest party. Perhaps today he'd show up at a tailgate. Perhaps today he'd show up at a NASCAR race. I don't know why, but maybe. Maybe he'd show up at a car show. Today, what is it to you that you look for and enjoy? What is it? What celebration do you anticipate the greatest? How do we look for heaven? How do we anticipate heaven? What do we look for when we think of heaven? Rusty and I hang out a lot together these days. I don't know why. Maybe he gets bored with life. We just hang out. We talk a lot about heaven. Y'all don't get all weepy on this. This is going to be fun. We talk a lot about heaven. And when we start looking at this passage, I think we get the most perfect picture of heaven we can imagine. Why? Because some of us think of heaven as possibly being boring. We're just going to sit around singing all day long. And for you men, you're like, I'm not really sure I'm down for singing all day long. I can't really sing here. Like, I'm not real good at singing here, so how am I going to be good at singing there? I once had a worship leader, now this is a side story, at my church in Ohio, who gave me a t-shirt and said, you can wear that t-shirt as long as you never sing. She's like, you just need to stop singing. She was our worship leader and also the director of the gospel choir there at our university. And I was like, I don't think that's a good thing. She says, well, just wear it anyway. So I understand, I can relate to you men who think, I'm just not real sure I'm down with singing all the time. But I think we get a picture of what heaven will possibly be like when we look at John chapter 2. Why? Because it's going to be a feast. It's going to be a party. It's going to have the best foods. It's going to have the best drinks. It's going to be people celebrating. And it's not going to be a celebration where things run out. It's not going to be a celebration where things end. It's going to be a time of happiness and joy all the time. So when you think of your greatest tailgate, the Alabama game, or whatever sport you celebrate, or when you think of your greatest NASCAR race where people do crazy things and sit in the infield, or when you think of the Kentucky Dirt, whatever it is for you, when people are just sitting around celebrating and doing things and looking for things all the time, the snowbirds who are gone, who are missing this, when they're looking for the sun, that's a perfect picture of looking for heaven. Why? Because God is described as the sun. Why in heaven do we not need the sun and the moon and the stars more? Because Jesus illuminates all of heaven. And so when our snowbirds go off looking for the sun in the wintertime, they won't have to do that anymore. Why? Because Jesus is illuminating and providing every sustenance that we need. And so that's a great picture. It's a great picture. When we go off looking for sustenance and joy and happiness, like it's what we have. And get this, okay? Stick with me here for just a few more minutes. When the world is looking for heaven, where should they go to look for it? They should look at believers. Why? Because believers, the church, should be a direct reflection of heaven. Why? Because we should have the most joy. We should throw the biggest parties. We should have the greatest celebrations. Why? Because we're the people who have something to celebrate in this world. We're the people who have the right to throw a party because we know what the end is going to be. And so everything that we should do in this life should be about a party. We should have the most decorated parties. We should have the most decorated. We should draw people in because we should be reflecting heaven in all that we do and all that we say, because everything we do is about celebrating. You know, I've been making fun of Fundy Baptists all along because it's true. Fundy Baptists should be about major celebration. If there's one thing we should be fundamental about, it should be about how big of a party are we going to throw next time? How can we up the next party? How can we outdo ourselves the next time? Because what we do should attract people in how we celebrate. Right? That's what it should be about. I'm not talking about wine here. Y'all drop the scowls. Okay, we moved on. Use the Kool-Aid. I don't care. But we should have the biggest parties because that's what heaven represents. An eternal celebration of God. An eternal celebration of the joy of the presence of being restored. Like Adam walked around naming animals, he ended up calling something a hippopotamus. Like what? How do you end up there? Because he was full of the presence of God and he had joy. Like we should be a people who, when they see us leaving this building, there's nothing but joy exuding off. We should be a place that serves our community and loves our community because there's nothing but joy exuding off. We should be looking forward to heaven because our lives reflect Him. Everything we do and say reflects Him. And even as we're walking closer to the end of what God has placed our life on this earth for, we can be even more joyful because we say, okay, time for us to join the real party. Time for us to enter the real party. Revelations 19. Verse 6, and it says, then when I heard what seemed to be the voice of a great multitude, like a roar of many waters, and like the sound of many pearls of thunder, crying out, Hallelujah, for the Lord our God, the Almighty reigns. Let us rejoice and exult and give Him the glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come. It's a wedding feast has come, and His bride has made herself ready, and it was granted her to clothe herself with fine linen, and bright and pure, for the fine linen is the righteous deeds of the saints. And the angel said to me, write this, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said to me, these are the true words of God. And then I fell down at His feet and I worshiped Him. But He said to me, you must not do that. I am a fellow servant with you and your brothers who hold to the testimony of Jesus. Worship God. For the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. Get this picture. Perhaps our greatest evangelism tool is our parties. A lot of us think that we're not really good at sharing the gospel. Perhaps our greatest way of sharing the gospel is being full of joy and being full of the party. Being full people who draw people into belief because we're full of celebrating. It's going to be the greatest party ever. It is going to be the greatest celebration that you have ever been to. The best of the best of the best, the best banquet you have ever witnessed, and never ending, and not like banquet food. Not like banquet food. It's going to be good food. It's going to be good. And it's going to have the most joy and the most excitement. We look around our culture and we find people who are constantly looking for something to fill themselves up. They're constantly looking for parties to go to, looking for something to celebrate. And we have the answers. We have the reasons to be captivated right here in us, in this room. This is our job as believers, is to show them a glimpse of the party that they have in store for them for eternity if they believe in the King. If they believe in the King. When we are living this life and we are walking day by day as believers, we do not look for joy in this world. Catch this. We do not need to look for joy in this world in our jobs, in our relationships, in the events and things of this world. We do not look for our spouse to solve our problems. We find joy in those places. We find joy in those places because of God, who is God, and how God has created us to be joy in those places. Catch that. We don't look for joy in our jobs. We don't look for joy in our neighborhoods. We don't look for joy in our marriage, but we find joy because of who God is and how God has placed us to be joy in our jobs, how God has created us to be joy in our neighborhoods, how God has created us to be joy in our marriage, how God has created us to be joy in every place that we go. God has created us to be the joy, not to look for joy. That's fundamentally important to how we do this life. Jesus at this wedding feast is pointing those early disciples to the feast that is yet to come, to the feast that we know when we turn the aisle and look down. When we turn the aisle and look down that aisle, when we enter into that presence, we look down that aisle and we see Jesus standing at the throne waiting for each of us. This is the marriage celebration that we should each yearn for, the joy that should make us giddy when we look at our lives. Not that we cannot be excited for the moments that come and go, but the reality that there will be nothing that can compare to the celebration that Jesus has prepared. Let us just yearn for that. Let us look for that as we close this morning. Let us hear the words of John in Revelations 21. And he says, I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. That's enough. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. But it gets better. And God himself will be with them as their God, and he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. And he who was seated on the throne said, Behold, I am making all things new. And he said, Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. And he said to me, It is done. Booklift this morning, let us be a people who are his people. And he is our God. Let us be a people who are known to celebrate. This isn't a sermon illustration for me, guys. I've been talking to our vision team. I've been talking to everybody. I am serious about our celebration. We need to change the way we do life to celebrate the kingdom. We need to be a people who party seriously. We need to be a people who love, and love. Because the way we love reflects the way we worship. We love God. We worship God. We love each other. And we love our community. And when we do that, we party better than the rest of the world. We've got to admit that the one thing this community needs right now is a good party. And it needs a party that's thrown by a group of people who love Jesus. Who love Jesus. We've been full of anxiety and sadness for week after week. We have nothing but a reason for celebration as we walk towards the kingdom day by day. This morning, if you aren't a believer, you think I'm a lunatic, and that's okay. My kids do too. We invite you to hear the gospel, to be transformed, to know Jesus this morning. Take that card that's on that chair back in front of you. Mark it. Talk to me or Bruce this morning. Talk to any of our leadership this morning. We want to connect with you. We want you to hear the gospel. If you're a believer this morning, we invite you to join us on this journey of celebrating. If you're not a member of Booklift, talk to us. If you're a member of Booklift, we invite you to celebrate with us. Celebrate the joy of the kingdom. Because whether we're moments away from death, days away from death, life, years away from death, none of us know. We could walk out that door today and that could be it for us. We all walk around like we have a friend dying. Who knows, we could be that friend. Let's stop worrying about our friend and start dealing with ourselves. Our friend's in really good shape right now. He's in real good shape. How about we start reflecting on who God and what God is doing in us and start celebrating like our friend is celebrating? Because that's what God is calling us to do. Let's pray together this morning and let God transform who we are and how we live.